last week we talked about heart issues, and this week we're going to talk about sin, and they're very closely connected. If you remember, it didn't take long in our discussion about heart for it to come out that the heart was wicked and deceitful, and that was tied to sin. So there's no mistake there. And there we go. Okay, so I put actually, I have a few different verses that I want us to go through. And so I put them on here because I know it's really hard to like flip around the Bible and stuff, but if there's one key verse, it's going to be here, Genesis 4:7. So go ahead and turn there first. There's probably one other one I'll have you turn to later. So Genesis 4:7, just in the context, this is right after the fall. Interestingly, when I looked up sin, I thought I would see the first mention of the word sin in the fall, in Genesis 3, right? With Adam and Eve, and they took the forbidden fruit and kept it out of the garden, all that stuff. Well, that was the beginning of sin, but at the time the word is actually first used is in chapter 4. And the person who says the word first ever is God. So I thought that's interesting. So that's where we're at in Genesis 4:7. And if you're familiar with the whole Cain and Abel story, they both bring offerings to God. Abel's is acceptable, Cain's is not. We could get into more of that, but specifically we're looking at God's response to Cain. So that starts in verse 6, so Genesis 4:6. Then the Lord said to Cain, "Why are you angry, and why is your countenance fallen? If you do well, will not your countenance be lifted up?" Or another translation might say, "Surely you will be accepted. If you do not do well, sin is crouching at the door, and its desire is for you, but you must master it." So God is saying, how do I deal with sin? What's going on with sin, and how do I deal with it? That's a really good place to begin. So what we're going to hopefully cover this morning is we're going to define sin, and hopefully you're going to help me with these things. We're going to talk about what sin does, the result of sin, and then probably the most important part is how to escape from sin's trap. Because if we can like, hey, I'm an expert on sin, I can write a doctoral thesis on it, but I don't know how to escape from its trap, it's not really going to do much good. But if I start here and say, hey, I ought to escape from sin's trap, but we don't address like how this sort of evil it actually is, then maybe we don't want to be escape from the trap. Maybe we think it's a nice trap to hang out in or something. So that's why we're going to do that. So has anybody heard any definition of sin through their time? Eric?
Well, Genesis chapter 8, we just talked about this morning in Bible class. In verse 21, God is saying, "I will never again curse the ground on account of man, for the intent of man's heart is evil from his youth."
Okay, so we got evil intent, and again, that goes from last week, the evil heart from its youth. So it's not, we talk about that too, like, kids are so cute and innocent, and sinners. So it's there from the very beginning, that sin nature. What do you know about sin, Jenny?
I've kind of heard of that, anything that separates us from God.
Yeah, so any sort of separation from God. God has a standard of holiness. Anything that doesn't meet that standard is sin. Did I see that? Yeah, Nancy?
Disobedience to God.
Okay, yeah, so they're similar. So God's got a standard of holiness. If we don't meet it, it's sin. God has commands that we're to obey. And if we don't obey them, that is sin. Yeah, and so both of those are hitting on it comes out, I think, more in the Greek definition, but sin of missing the mark. So if you think of shooting a bow and arrow, you got a target going for right the middle, and you miss the mark. You don't hit it. Maybe you miss the target completely, right? Some people we can point out they're saying, "Oh, look, you didn't even hit the target." Like, that's terrible. Some people are actually shooting the arrow the opposite direction of the target. They're like not even close. But you could just be like an eighth of a millimeter off of the center. You still miss the mark. And that's sort of the thing of sin, because sin has a very high standard. I'm going to throw a couple of verses up here that I think were helpful for me looking at what sin is and defining it. So the first one is 2 Chronicles 12:14. Can anybody see that enough to read it out loud? I don't know how. Can you see that, Tom?
He did evil because he did not set his heart to seek the Lord.
So what do we learn about sin from that? How would you define sin from that verse?
Not striving towards.
Yeah, he's not striving towards the Lord. He's not setting his heart. So here, again, the heart issues and the sin, there's a reason I'm doing these back-to-back weeks. They are connected. You're not setting your heart. Remember, talking about heart was like that desire, the will, the gumption. He's saying he didn't set his heart to seek the Lord. So that's a key thing. Where is my heart set? That can define what sin is. Here's another one from Deuteronomy 29:18. Can somebody read that one? Jenny? It's my own daughter and I did it. Go ahead, Jenny.
So that there will not be among you a man or woman or family or tribe whose heart turns away today from the Lord our God to go and serve the gods of those nations, that there will not be among you a root bearing poisonous fruit among us.
All right. So how do you find sin from this verse? What do you get from that? And I'm sorry, I'm not giving you a lot of context in these.
Turning away from God.
Study them all; they're great. But turning away from God, seeking idols, and usually they go together, right? When here's God, and I say, nope, God, I don't want that. There's usually something over here that I want instead. I want this idol. What was that?
No other God before him.
Yeah, so have no other God before me. So anything that goes in front of God, that would be another way to define sin. All right, here's from Romans 14:23. Someone read that?
But he who doubts is condemned if he eats, because his eating is not from faith, and whatever is not from faith is sin.
Okay, that's pretty obvious one there, right? Whatever is not from faith is from sin. And when it was Romans 9 this morning, our men's group, we were talking about that just belief and faith and how important that is. If it doesn't come from faith, it's sin. It's not going to be pleasing to God. Only way we can please God is by faith. It can't be by even by the things we do. We can't impress God with our lives, but only by faith. All right, and then James 4:17. We've got that one.
Therefore, to one who knows the right thing to do and does not do it, to him it is sin.
Okay, so this is dealing with a sin of omission, right? Like the Lord has made it very clear that I should do this, and I'm like, I'm too busy. I don't have time. Maybe someone else will do it. Those are thoughts that can happen. And so if you know what the right thing to do is and you don't do it, James says that's sin. Okay, I've got just one more. They're both from 1 John, so I put them together because they kind of go together. One is from 1 John chapter 3 and the other from chapter 5. Kim, you got that one? Okay, both of them.
Everyone who practices sin also practices lawlessness, and sin is lawlessness. All unrighteousness is sin, and there is a sin not leading to death. Okay,
so again, those are pretty clear. Sin is lawlessness, and all unrighteousness is sin. So if there's a sense of anything that is breaking the law, that's sin. So if you're catching the glimpse, putting all these together, we're getting a picture of what that is. Anything that's breaking the law is sin. Anything that is not that God's righteous standard, what God does is right living. Anything apart from that is unrighteous. All of that is sin. So if we kind of put that in a conglomeration, there are some things that we talked about, plus the other things we talked about, a little bit. What does sin look like? I think we've got a picture of sin. Now, what does sin do? The first place, we go right to that very first verse we looked at, Genesis 4:7. It says, sin is crouching at the door. So we see that sin crouches, and then it says its desire is for you. And if you take that to 1 Peter 5:8 and connect them, you'll see how that goes. It says, be of sober spirit. I'm on 1 Peter 5:8. Be on the alert. Your adversary, the devil, prowls around like a roaring lion, seeking someone to devour. So when I'm talking about the sin is crouching at the door, it's literally like an animal of prey, and it's right outside the door, and it doesn't ever go away. Even if we accept Christ, we say, okay, great, my life's perfect. No, sin is still crouching right at the door, and some translations say like sin is lying at the door. I don't think it's the best. I think a best translation. I think it's, you think of if you've seen those nature videos, or if you have cats, where they're like on their haunches and their butts wiggling back and forth, and they're ready to get something. Like they're ready. That's what sin is crouching at the door, and its desire is for you, or it's seeking someone to devour. Sin has an appetite. Sin is hungry, and what sin wants is us. We're like the flesh. If you've read Screw Tape Letters from C.S. Lewis, you get that picture. If you haven't, I encourage you to read it. You get a picture of the demons are seeking after humans because they literally feed off of us. And the more they can get us to sin, they can get us into hell. They get this meal, which is us. They get our souls. And they don't, and so you see like that desire. It's like a hunger, like a hungry cat, if you will, right? So the Blue Letter Bible said it this way: sin will always lay in wait for you, like a hungry wild beast of prey. So it's just ready. It's just there. And that's an important thing to recognize about what sin is, because it's just always waiting for us, just to get us. It's always waiting. But I got a few other verses that I think will kind of fill in some of those pieces. What does sin do? So first of all, it crouches. It's hungry for us. But here's Hebrews 3:13. Can someone read that for me?
But encourage one another day after day, as long as it is still called today, so that none of you will be hardened by the deceitfulness of sin.
So what does sin do? What is one of the effects of sin?
Makes you deceitful.
Yeah, deceitfulness. So we've got lying. Is that what you said too?
I said hardened.
Yeah, also hardens you. And we talked about that last week, the hardened of heart. So speaking of heart surgery and Paul, right? So I'm not a heart doctor. There's like these things that like go in your heart, and it blocks up your heart, the blood pumping through. What is that called? Cholesterol. Okay, we'll go with that. So you got like sin is like cholesterol, and like starts to block up, and then it gets hardened, and then the blood can't flow through anymore. So you're seeing sin. It actually literally is hardening our hearts. We talked about other effects of sin hardening too, but that's part of it. Here's another one. James 1:14 and 15. Somebody read that?
But each one is tempted when he is carried away and enticed by his own lust. Then when lust is conceived, it gives birth to sin. And when sin is accomplished, it brings forth death.
Okay, so this is almost like a flow chart. If you can picture this. Like, you're tempted and carried away by lust. Lust then leads to sin, and sin leads to what?
Death.
Death. And physical death, spiritual death, social death, relational death. There's all sorts of effects that sin has, but it brings forth death. That's just the natural, like that's what sin is designed to do, right? So if you let sin do what it's going to do, it's going to lead to death. That's what it wants to do. Okay, let's go one more. Okay, there we go. So there's a little picture of what sin does. In one way, you think about, even in that James passage, actually maybe I'll go back, we can look at that. Sin is sort of like putting itself out there as like bait. So if you think about the concept of fishing, I'm a terrible fisherman, but I know enough that you put bait out there and you're trying to get the fish to eat the hook, right? You don't just put a hook out there, because the fish would say, well, that's a hook. I'm not going to eat that. So you make it look like something tasty. And that's in a sense what sin is doing. And the fish starts to say, well, I don't know why there's a worm floating around there, but it looks good. Maybe I'll try it. And so it goes after it. And so in a sense, like, the bait is not what it really looks like. Like even if you use fake bait, you're even be more deceptive. But even if you use live bait, it's like, oh, it looks like a worm, I'll go eat it. But it's actually a hook inside a worm. And so when sin is deceiving us like bait, it's like that. It's not what it really looks like. So again, you picture that crouching at the door, and then you've got this bait here. And what happens, I don't know, I don't think fish are really that smart. I don't know what their brain capacity is, but if I was a fish, I could think like this. Like, you start to see this thing floating here, and maybe your cousin Ned disappeared one time because he went after that thing, and he's not around anymore. But you're like, well, that was a long time ago, and this is safer waters. Like, that happened way over in that part of the lake. And then you start to think, it really can't be that, but that's a really juicy looking worm. That looks really good. you just start thinking about it, and you start kind of swimming around it and looking at it, and you're like, well, man, if it was a trick, like, it probably wouldn't be there anymore. And then you like, the worm's moving still, like, yeah, it looks like it's still alive. And you start to want it so bad, you're like, you don't even think about the consequences anymore. Like, it can't be that bad, I'm just going for it. And then you dive in. And all of a sudden it doesn't, you're not thinking about what your other fish friends think or what God thinks. So when you think about taking that bait, what happens is all we start to think about is wanting that thing. And that thing can be a few different things. It can look different. It could be sexual sin, like I just want that sexual desire fulfilled. It could be wealth. If I just had that much money, or if I just had that possession, or if it could be freedom or independence. If I just had that freedom, if I could do whatever I wanted, then I'd be happy. And so we focus on it, we fixate on it, and that's all we see. And then we don't care about anything else. We don't even care about the consequences. Like, yeah, maybe I learned back in Sunday school that's not the right thing to do, but you just don't care anymore because you're so focused on the bait. That's what fishing is doing for us. I'm also not very much of a hunter, but I have watched Duck Dynasty. And they were turkey hunting one time, and they didn't know anything about turkey hunting either. But they, you put out decoys, and duck decoys too. But for the turkeys in particular, you call to them, and you're like doing these mating calls, and you're trying to trick the toms to come and mate with this fake, and that's not even a real turkey. And so again, it's this deception. I think that concept of deception of sin is a really big thing. And then what happens is, bam, you're in the trap. You've eaten the hook, or you've taken the bait inside the trap, and now you're trapped in. And now you're trapped in sin. And so that leads us to that third thing we're talking about. So what sin is, what it does, but then what's the result? What happens after we've taken the bait, after we've fallen into the trap? What does it look like? And I've got a few more verses here for us on that. So there's my summary of what sin does. All right, so can I have someone read both of those? Deuteronomy 20:18 and Hebrews 12:15 go together. We're looking at what happens after you're in the trap. Abby, yeah, thank you.
So that there will not be among you a man or woman, or family or tribe, whose heart turns away today from the Lord our God, to go and serve the gods of those nations. That there will not be among you a root bearing poisonous fruit and wormwood. Deuteronomy 29:18. Hebrews 12:13. See to it that no one comes short of the grace of God, that no root of bitterness springing up causes trouble, and by it many be defiled.
Okay, so what do you see in some of the results of sin from these verses? What happens when you fall in the trap? Or take the bait?
It gets rooted in you.
Yeah, it gets done. It's like completely, yeah. And what happens to those roots? Bitter, yeah, you get bitter fruit, poisonous fruit, bitterness. Talking about coming short, the Hebrews passage, see that no one comes short of the grace of God, that bitterness springs up. We talked about that with heart, and one of the things that causes the hardened heart is bitterness or anger. So bitterness can spring up between one another. Look what else it does. It causes trouble. So all sorts of different kinds of trouble, and many are defiled. Because so it's my friend in high school she said, sin is like puke. It doesn't just affect you, it gets on everybody around you. And so when sin happens, it's messy. Like many people get defiled from it. And so you see that's a sense of ugliness. Here's another one from Hebrews 3:13. We read this one before, but this time I want you to see that none of you be hardened by the deceitfulness of sin. And we talked about that. So there's a hardening. Okay, you start to say, yeah, I'm in this trap, but I want to be here. Like this is my favorite place to be. Or I like that, I like that bait. It was worth it. And you start to trick yourself. Or you see, hey Joe, come over here and eat this food with me. This is pretty good. Like misery loves company. Come and eat this. Come and drink this. You start to be hardened and you want to invite other people into it. Okay, here's a couple. So from John 8 and then Romans 7. It's going to take us. Can somebody read those two? All right, Nancy?
Jesus answered them, "Truly, truly, I say to you, everyone who commits sin is a slave of sin. For we know that the law is spiritual, but I am of flesh, sold into bondage to sin."
Okay, so what's the result of sin? You become a slave to it. Like I said, when you start like fixating so much on that bait, it's the only thing you're thinking about. You're actually, even before you've taken the bait, you're already a slave to that thing. Sin wants to be master. That's why, going back to the key verse from Genesis 4:7, God said, "Sin is crushing your door, its desire is free, but you must master it." If you don't, the alternative is sin will master you. There is no like neutral ground. There's no like, oh, sin and I can just get along and be friends. Like, sin will do its thing and I'll do my thing. Like, nope, somebody's going to master. Either you got to master sin or it's going to master you. It wants to turn us into slaves. I'll read this one. "No one who abides in him sins. No one who sins has seen him or knows him." Think about the effects of that. If we are in this lifestyle of sin, all of a sudden we can't see God. I can't hear from God anymore. I don't know what his direction is. I don't feel like I'm as close to him, like I know him as much. That's because sin is in the way. If you're, and this is, we all sin. It's not talking about living the perfect life. It's talking about living in this lifestyle of sin, this habitual sin, this sinning so much that when you get to that hardened point, you say, it doesn't even matter. Like, I just want to do this thing. You're not going to hear from God. He's going to seem distant. That's a pretty serious effect, result from sin. And then ultimately, and we read this somewhere else too, but Ephesians 2, you were dead in your trespasses and sins. Sin, ultimately, the end result, James talked about it too, is death. It's going to cause us to death. I read an article about, what were they? Fruit flies. Fruit flies. They actually hatch their eggs inside the blossom of the fruit, and then the fruit grows up around them, and then the eggs hatch. So the fruit flies actually are inside the fruit, and they eat their way out. That's a really good picture of sin. That's why we talked about heart issues last week, because it starts the very inside and eats its way out. What we see, and we like to see other people's sins. We see them before we see our own. But what we see in other people is we see the result of rotten fruit, and we say, oh, that's a mess. But it actually starts on the inside. So that's the result of sin. It leads to death, but it leads from death from the inside out. That's why we can be walking around in sin even though we're still physically alive, but spiritually dead, is because it starts on the inside and it's working its way out. Okay, so this is a pretty serious thing. That's why we talked about the last thing. How do we escape from sin's trap? If there's one other passage, I'll have you actually go up and look up on your own. There's an Isaiah one. We'll just keep going. We got that. You got the point. Romans chapter 7. I would encourage you to turn to this. It's kind of a bigger chunk and an important one. The escape from sin, from the trap. Hey, we're hanging on a hook. If you're a fish, you're meant to be in the water. You're hanging on a hook, dangling in the air, wondering, how did I get here? And you're probably actually wondering, how do I get off this thing? That's why, when you fish, at least when you first pull them out of the water, they're flopping around a lot. They're like, I'm not supposed to be here, and I'm going to do everything I can to get out of here. And then they actually start to calm down because they start to give up. Romans 7:14 through 8:4. I want to read this out loud. For we know that the law is spiritual, but I am of flesh, sold into bondage to sin. Then we talked about that. For what I am doing, I do not understand. For I am not practicing what I would like to do, but I am doing the very thing I hate. I love this. This passage is so helpful for me because Paul's a pretty saintly guy, and yet he had this struggle with sin. And I just so thankful that he shared it publicly. Like, I want to do this, but I'm not doing it. I don't want to do this, and that's what I'm doing. Verse 16, but if I do the very thing I do not want to do, I agree with the law, confessing that the law is good. So now no longer am I the one doing it, but sin which dwells in me. For I know that nothing good dwells in me, that is in my flesh. For the willing is present in me, but the doing of the good is not. You know, so many like New Year's resolutions, like, I'm going to do this different this year. Like, I'm desiring to do this. And then, it's January 14th and it's already gone. The will is there, but the doing of good is not. Verse 19, for the good that I want, I do not do, but I practice the very evil that I do not want. But if I am doing the very thing I do not want, I am no longer the one doing it, but sin which dwells in me. I always wonder about these couple of verses. Like, it almost sounds like Paul saying, well, it's not my fault. It's sin doing it. It's sin's doing it inside of me. It's like, I'm just a victim of the sin in me. He's not saying that, but I think in our society we turned it into that a lot. He's saying, man, the sin nature in me, what can I do? Verse 21. Or is that 20? But if I'm doing the very thing I do not want, I am no longer the one doing it, but sin which dwells in me. Verse 21. I find then the principle that evil is present in me, the one who wants to do good. For I joyfully concur with the law of God in the inner man, but I see a different law in the members of my body, waging war against the law of my mind and making me a prisoner of the law of sin which is in my members. Wretched man that I am. If we've just done this like very quick kind of just study of what sin is, and you haven't come to that conclusion, then go and study more in the Bible about sin. Because the conclusion we need to come to is, wretched man or woman that I am. Who will set me free from this body of this death? If you don't ask that question, then don't read the next verse. Because we just want to jump right to like, oh, the gospel, it's so good. If you don't acknowledge that there is just, the heart is deceitfully wicked, we talked about last week. Wretched man that I am, this sin nature is fighting within me. Who will set me free from the body of this death? Ask the question. If you don't ask the question, don't read the verse. So I'm assuming you've asked the question because I'm reading the next verse. Thanks be to God. How will this happen? Thanks be to God through Jesus Christ our Lord. So then on the one hand, I myself with my mind am serving the law of God, but on the other with my flesh the law of sin. Chapter 8, verse 1. Therefore, there is now no condemnation for those who are in Christ Jesus. For the law of the Spirit of life in Christ Jesus has set you free from the law of sin and death. For what the law could not do, weak as it was through the flesh, God did, sending his own Son in the likeness of sinful flesh, and as an offering for sin, he condemned sin in the flesh, so that the requirement of the law might be fulfilled in us who do not walk according to the flesh, but according to the Spirit. So here we are, caught in the trap, wondering what's going on, maybe hanging from the hook, and Jesus comes and says, I'm going to take you off of that. I'm going to open this trap up and let you walk out. So how do we escape from sin's trap? Well, very clearly, Jesus does it for us. He pulls us out of the trap and he gives us freedom. But I want to go back to Genesis 4:7. Sin, if you do well, will not your countenance be lifted up, or will you not be accepted? I probably like that translation a little better. In other words, if you do well, God's with you. He's going to accept you. If you do not do well, sin's right there ready for you. It's hungry. It's desirous you, wants to crush you, but you must master it. Sin. You must master sin. Now we know, thanks be to God, that Jesus Christ came and took us out of the trap, set us free, and we get to walk. But what can happen sometimes is that we just walk right back into another trap. Oh, thank you, Jesus, for saving me. Oh, that looks interesting. Let me go over here. And before you know it, right back in the trap. Jesus, help me, help me. And Jesus is so merciful. He will help you again. Praise God. I probably wouldn't. I probably would do it once, maybe twice tops. But Jesus is better than that, and you can be thankful for that. But we don't want to just keep walking that trap where you're like, oh, I'm never going for that trap again. I've learned my lesson. And you're like, oh, but what about this over here? And you start, that looks enticing. So we talk about Jesus freeing us from that trap. But then God said to Cain, God said this, that you must master sin. So how do we master sin? My conclusion is just one verse in Proverbs, which is a really clear verse, which also ties into last week from Proverbs 24:23. Watch over your heart with all diligence. That it doesn't just mean like, oh, when I think about it, or I'll pray about it once in a while. With all diligence, like it's my focus, like I'm watching over my heart, because from it flow the springs of life. Jesus Christ has set us free from sin, and we can rejoice in that freedom. But he didn't give us freedom so we could find as many traps as possible. He actually gave us freedom so that we could go and warn other people about traps. So we could live a life of freedom, so we could live a life of joy. And for that to happen, okay, Christ has done his work. He's done everything. And yet he says, I want you to stay out of the traps. That means we have to watch our heart, because our heart is the one that starts to be excited about that bait, the different kinds of sin. And then all of a sudden, we're right back in.